On the night of April 14th, 1912, over 2,200 people sat down to eat on the same ship. They breathed the same cold North Atlantic air. They were sailing toward the same destination. And within hours, they would all face the same fate. But what they ate that night could not have been more different. On one end of the ship, 11 courses, fine china, vintage wine, a meal that would have been extraordinary in the finest restaurants in London or New York. On the other end, a simple bowl of soup, a piece of bread, a shared dining room with wooden benches. Same ship, same night. Two completely different worlds. And when the Titanic hit that iceberg just before midnight, the difference between those two dining rooms didn't just reflect a difference in wealth. It reflected a difference in survival odds that is almost impossible to look at without feeling something. This is the story of the last meal served on the Titanic. What they ate, who ate it, and what happened to them when the meal was over. Part 1. The ship that was designed to impress. Before we talk about the food, you need to understand what the Titanic actually was. It wasn't just a ship. It was a statement. The White Star Line, the company that owned the Titanic, was in a fierce competition with rival Cunard Line for dominance of the transatlantic passenger route. Cunard had speed. Their ships were faster. White Star decided to compete on luxury instead. The Titanic was designed, from the beginning, to be the most opulent passenger ship ever built, and the food was central to that promise. The first-class dining experience on the Titanic was not meant to feel like a ship. It was meant to feel like the finest hotel in Europe, floating. They hired a kitchen staff of over 60 people dedicated to first-class dining alone. They stocked the ship with 75,000 pounds of fresh meat, 40,000 eggs, 1,500 gallons of fresh milk, 1,000 sweetbreads, 36,000 apples, fine wines, vintage champagnes, and a wine cellar that rivaled some of the best restaurants in the world. The Titanic wasn't just carrying passengers across the Atlantic. It was performing wealth at a scale the world had rarely seen on water. And on the other end of the ship, a completely different calculation was being made. Part 2. First Class. The 11-course dinner. The first-class dinner served on the evening of April 14th, the last full dinner before the collision, has been meticulously documented. The menu survived. Passengers described it in letters written before the ship sank, and what it shows is a meal of extraordinary excess for a Sunday evening at sea. It began with hors d'oeuvres, oysters, which we now know were once poverty food, but by 1912 had already completed their transformation into a luxury item, served cold, on ice, with lemon. Then came the first soup course, cream of barley, rich, smooth, and designed to prepare the palate for what followed. The fish course came next, poached salmon with mousseline sauce and cucumber. The salmon had been stored in specially designed cold rooms to maintain freshness across the Atlantic. Then a series of entrees, filet mignon, sauté of chicken, lamb with mint sauce. The meat had been sourced from the finest suppliers in England before departure. The roast course followed, roasted duckling with applesauce, sirloin of beef, cold asparagus vinaigrette, then a cold buffet, pâté, potted shrimps, soused herrings, dishes designed to be picked at between the heavier courses, then dessert, peaches and chartreuse jelly, Waldorf pudding, chocolate and vanilla eclairs, French ice cream, then cheese, Stilton, Camembert, Roquefort, served with crackers and celery, then fresh fruit, grapes, peaches and oranges from stores that had been kept in specially cooled rooms since the ship departed Southampton, then coffee, cigars for the gentlemen, liqueurs for those who wanted them, 11 courses, approximately 4 hours at the table. And this was not a special occasion dinner. This was a regular Sunday evening meal for first-class passengers on the Titanic. The total cost of a first-class ticket on the Titanic was equivalent to roughly $100,000 in today's money, and the dining experience was a significant part of what that price was paying for. Part 3. Second class. The meal most people forget. Most accounts of Titanic dining focus on the dramatic contrast between first and third class, but second class deserves its own moment, because what second class passengers were served that night is remarkable for a different reason. The second class menu on April 14th included consommé tapioca soup, baked haddock with sharp sauce, curried chicken and rice, spring lamb with mint sauce, roast turkey with cranberry sauce, plum pudding, wine jelly, coconut sandwiches, American ice cream, This was second class. By the standards of 1912, or frankly by the standards of most restaurants today, this was an exceptional meal. Food historians who have studied the Titanic menus consistently note that the second-class dining experience on the Titanic exceeded what most first-class passengers would have received on competing ships. White Star Line used second-class dining as a selling point. They understood that the middle-class passenger of 1912 was newly affluent, newly aspirational, and wanted to feel the experience of luxury without paying first-class prices. The second-class dining room on the Titanic had real mahogany furniture, proper linens, a full waitstaff. It was designed to feel like a good hotel restaurant, not a ship cafeteria. And then there was third class, and the contrast was absolute. Part 4, Third Class, What the Forgotten Passengers Ate. Third-class passengers on the Titanic, also called steerage, were a different world entirely. Most of them were immigrants, Irish, Scandinavian, Eastern European, Middle Eastern families, making the journey to America in search of a life they couldn't build at home. They had sold what they had to buy their tickets. For many of them, the crossing represented everything they owned, converted into a single journey. The third-class dining room was functional. Wooden benches, long communal tables, no individual waitstaff. Food was served cafeteria style. The menu for April 14th in third class included vegetable soup, freshly baked bread, cabin biscuits, a main course of boiled rice and pork, boiled potatoes, roast beef, bread and butter pudding for dessert, tea or coffee. This was not bad food by the standards of what most third-class passengers ate at home. The White Star Line actually prided itself on providing better food than steerage passengers typically received on other lines. For many immigrants on board, the meals served in third class were more regular and more substantial than what they had been eating in their home countries. But compare it to 11 courses of lobster and foie gras 50 meters away on the same ship, and the distance between those two dining rooms becomes something much larger than a physical space. It becomes a representation of the entire social order of 1912, of who mattered, of whose comfort was worth investing in, of who was expected to survive if something went wrong. If you're finding this as fascinating as we are, hit like and subscribe. We cover stories like this every single week, and there is a lot more where this came from. Part 5. What happened when the music stopped? The first-class dinner ended around 11 p.m. Passengers retired to the smoking room, the reception rooms, the private promenades. Some played cards. Some had a final drink at the bar. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic struck the iceberg. What happened next is one of the most documented disasters in history, but the survival statistics, viewed through the lens of those dining rooms, tell a story that is almost impossible to sit with comfortably. Of the first-class passengers aboard the Titanic, approximately 62% survived. Of the second-class passengers, approximately 41% survived. Of the third-class passengers, the immigrants who had sold everything to make this journey, approximately 25% survived. The lifeboats were loaded from the top of the ship down. First-class passengers had immediate access to the boat deck. Many were personally escorted by crew members. Some were woken before the general alarm was sounded. Third-class passengers were in the lower decks. Some accounts, disputed but documented, suggest that certain gates between third-class areas and the upper decks were locked or guarded in the early stages of the evacuation. The official inquiries that followed were inconclusive on this point, but the survival numbers speak in a language that requires no interpretation. The people who ate 11 courses that night had a 62% chance of seeing the morning. The people who ate boiled rice and bread had a 25% chance. Same ship, same iceberg, same freezing water. Different odds. Part 6. The food they never finished. Here's a detail that almost never appears in Titanic documentaries. When the Titanic sank, the kitchens were still stocked. The food that had been loaded in Southampton, the 75,000 pounds of meat, the 40,000 eggs, the 1,000 sweetbreads, the vintage wines, the fresh cream, the carefully stored fruit, went down with the ship. Restaurant menus that had been printed for the following days were recovered from the water. Some were found in lifeboats, tucked into pockets of survivors who had grabbed them almost without thinking. A first-class luncheon menu for April 15th, the day after the sinking, was recovered from a lifeboat and is now one of the most valuable pieces of Titanic memorabilia in existence. It lists dishes that were never served, food that was never eaten, a meal that was planned for a morning that never came. There is something about that detail that captures the Titanic story more precisely than almost anything else. The absolute confidence of a ship that printed menus for tomorrow. The ordinary planning of people who had no way of knowing that tomorrow wasn't coming. And tucked inside a lifeboat, carried across the water by a survivor who would spend the rest of their life trying to understand what had happened. A piece of paper listing dishes for a breakfast that the ocean swallowed whole. On the night of April 14th, 1912, two dining rooms told the same story that every society tells, about who matters, who is protected, and who is left to find their own way out. The food was different, the survival odds were different, and the world that ship represented sank with it. If this made you see the Titanic differently, share it, and subscribe for more stories like this every week.